The sky above the barley plains was a kiln of blue fire, and the wind pushed waves through the grain like a giant creature breathing in its sleep. Engines sat on workbenches like open hearts, metal bright as second suns. Out there, where the horizon bowed, a titan in golden armor shook hands with a man whose palms were stained with oil. At the titan's flank stood a slight blue-skinned girl, her eyes the color of river ice, her shoulders bare to the heat, her silence carrying the weight of a verdict. They had called her too small for the blood that made her royal. They had called him too human for anything that mattered. The emperor had come to give away what he believed unworthy. The mechanic thought he was accepting a burden. Both were wrong, and the plains would remember the day the wind changed its song. The harvest planet of Oro wore its atmosphere like a bell of glass. Sounds traveled far and judgments traveled farther. The settlements were low to the ground, all corrugated shade and sun-baked concrete, while the empire of Valor pressed into the world from orbit. Ships like knives, banners like molten metal, proclamations that fell like rain nobody had asked for. Elias Ward worked alone where the barley met the workshop's shadow. He was a mechanic in the old sense. One hand to feel, one to listen, a head that waited before deciding. Or as farmers brought him their seed drones and irrigation lungs, their gleaning crawlers and wind harps. Machines spoke. He always said, if you shut up long enough, a bolt would confess how it wanted to sit. A bearing would whisper its preferred angle. The Empire did not love quiet men. The Empire loved spectacle, height, gold. And so the people were already gathered when Emperor Vir arrived. All polished plates and cathedral shoulders, light pooling along his ridged blue skin, the royal inlays burrowed into his armor like veins of a living planet. His voice thrummed low, the kind that made metal hum in sympathy. Aura's wind held still, as if it feared to breathe. At his side stood the girl. She might have been 16 by human guesswork, though her species matured differently. She had the same blue skin as her father, but softer, a shade like shadowed dawn. Her hair was dark, loose, restless in the wind. Her height, just reaching the emperor's hip plates, was the insult that followed her like a witness. In a palace that measured worth in meters, she was a sentence that never fit the page. "This is Naira, child of my blood," said Vir. Only then did the crowd begin to murmur, because to name was to claim, and the emperor's claim had always been tallest of all. "She will be placed under your care, mechanic," said Vir, turning his molten gaze on Elias. "The council whispers about her stature. They tally it like a flaw upon a ledger. Let them tally. A machine that will not fit the tower might yet till a field." Elias said nothing at first. It wasn't reverence. It was the strict habit of a man who knew that answers had a cost and that silence could buy time. Naira looked at the ground. The metal of the Emperor's gauntlet tightened once around Elias's hand, then released. "I mend gears," said Elias at last, the words dry as the day. "I do not mend daughters." "Gears, daughters, galaxies," said Vir with a smile that had no home in it. "All are systems. All obey balance. Balance is your craft, is it not?" The crowd snickered in a low, wet way. A boy near the front minded a measuring stick. A woman whispered, "Too short for a throne. Long enough to be a pawn." The Empire's herald drones recorded everything as drones do. Elias looked at Naira's wrists, slight, the tendons like silk cords, the hands steady despite the crowd. He had seen machines that trembled when their casing rang empty inside. She did not tremble. "She can stay," said Elias. Vir inclined his head as if a star had bowed. He turned, armor throwing shards of light across the barley, and stalked back to his landing craft, the air crackling in his wake. The sky swallowed him. The sound of engines faded, and with it the brief awe people feel when power recedes and they are left with themselves. Naira stood in the hot quiet. Someone laughed. Someone else threw a kernel that struck her shoulder and slid off without a sound. "You'll sleep in the storage room," said Elias, pointing toward the workshop. "It smells like metal and rain. If that's a problem, you can complain to the barley." She didn't smile. She nodded once. Behind them, the crowd's laughter thickened. But while the field laughed, the outsider's eyes shimmered faintly, as if holding a truth older than the stars. Word travels with a different gait in small places. By noon of the next day, the settlement knew the emperor had discarded his daughter like an ill-shaped bolt. By evening, they knew Elias had accepted the gift insult burden. Choose your noun. By dawn, Overseer Catherine knew, and Catherine was a man who polished his boots with the fear of others. He arrived at Elias's workshop with a retinue of local officials who enjoyed simple things done cruelly. Catherine wore an imitation of imperial design, cheap gold plating on a chest piece that creaked when he breathed too ambitiously. His voice was the kind that asked, "Are you going to fight me?" while his eyes answered, "Please don't." "Mechanic," Catherine said, spreading his arms to the table scattered with engines and torque keys. "The Empire is generous. It gives us the chance to demonstrate our compliance. Let us show we can raise royal refuse to serviceable function." Naira flinched at the word refuse, but only in the way a wire sings when touched. Elias stood between her and the retinue without thinking. The barley moved in a deep breeze that hadn't been there a moment before. "We'll host a test in the Hall of Scales," said Catherine, lips slick. "Before the midday bell, the Emperor's child will assemble a resonance engine under witness. If she fails, you both answer for mocking imperial grace." "And if she succeeds?" said Elias. Catherine smiled as if success were a joke he'd heard at a funeral. "Then we will all be surprised." The retinue chuckled. Drones above clicked lenses. Children practiced cruel rhymes about height because cruelty likes a tempo. Elias looked to Naira. Her gaze grazed the horizon, then fell back to the workbenches, to the open hearts of machines. "We'll go," said Naira, speaking for the first time. Her voice had depth to it, like the bass line of a song you almost forgot, but find yourself humming anyway. "You don't have to perform for them," said Elias. "I am always performing," said Naira. "This will at least have tools." They went. The Hall of Scales was named for the magnificent set of brass balances that hung there, meant to measure yields, debts, favors, everything that could be weighed and nothing that truly counted. The whole ceiling was a shimmer of thin glass laced with wires that glowed when the Empire transmitted proclamations. Today, it glowed like a low fever. On a long table lay the disassembled resonance engine, a core like a captured storm, a ring lattice to focus it, counter spindles, harmonic dampeners, memory coils where the engine kept its preferred songs. Naira blinked once, and a shadow crossed her eyes, the kind that comes from remembering a room you pretended to forget. "Begin," said Catherine. His smile was an insult with teeth. "Phones. Yes, even in galaxies, someone has a phone," rose to record. Laughter rose with them. The children had learned their rhyme. Naira laid her hands on the core. The waver in the room smoothed as if a large hand had pressed the air flat. She did not move for a count of 12. She listened. Elias recognized it. It was the look he wore when gears confided their secrets. "She won't even try," said someone loudly. "She's too short to reach the top ring," said another, and a small ring of laughter chimed. Naira breathed in. She reached, not with her arms first, but with a voice too low to hear, yet too physical to ignore. The core brightened in a pulse that matched her heartbeat. No one believed she would even try. But the silence that followed spread across the chamber like a storm. Naira moved without hurry. She set the counter spindles in their cradles, but at angles nobody used in the manuals. She took a memory coil, brushed it with her thumb, and a thin line of blue rose inside it as if pleased to be seen. The hall murmured, because there are ways of touching that are either worship or science, and sometimes both. Catherine leaned forward, cheeks damp. "The lattice first, girl, else the core spills," said Catherine. "The core is already latticed," said Naira, not looking up. "You simply never asked what shape it preferred." Elias nearly laughed. He kept his mouth closed because the air had the brittle quality of plates before an earthquake. He watched the way Naira's fingers barely lifted when moving a piece, as if she framed motion and let the pieces travel within it instead of forcing them along. He had done this with engines all his life. He had never seen it done with such intimacy. "Where did you learn?" said Elias softly. "In rooms where I was not tall enough for the mirrors," said Naira. The crowd sniggered at that. They did not know how to hear the heartbreak of a palace. A woman in a farmer's jacket, Mara, stepped nearer, curious, drawing her past caution. "Let the child work, Catherine," said Mara. "You'll ruin the balance with your breath." "My breath is the law," said Catherine. But he stepped back because law is often nothing more than a man who dislikes being watched while he's petty. Naira installed the harmonic dampeners last. She closed her eyes and hummed a note too low for the human ear. The engine brightened as if agreeing. When she opened her eyes, something passed through them. A translation of light into memory. Elias's chest tightened. Some people listen to machines. Naira was listened to by them. Catherine clapped slowly, a parody of praise. "The spin will judder at ignition, little one," said Catherine. "Your lattice is artistic. We require function." Naira looked at Elias. He could offer nothing but the true gift of any craftsperson, faith that the work will defend itself. Naira touched the starter. The resonance engine stirred and, just when everyone thought she would falter, the engine sang. It wasn't loud. Sound braided into air the way barley braids beneath wind. The ring lattice rotated at a fractional offset, then self-corrected along a curve that felt like forgiveness. The harmonic dampeners drank the waver. The core light steadied into a breathing that matched Naira's own. She stepped away, palms at her sides, throat working as if swallowing back an old hunger. "It will run 5% more efficiently than your chart," said Naira. Someone laughed to crush the wonder trying to be born. Catherine raised a hand for quiet, but his fingers trembled. "I see only rebellion by aesthetics," said Catherine. "We require proof." He signaled. An assistant wheeled forward a stress armature, a cruel scaffold used to wrench engines into failure for test data. He fastened it to the resonance engine like manacles. "If it withstands this, we will consider your art," said Catherine. Naira's breath stuttered. Elias stepped forward. "Enough," said Elias. "The demonstration is public, mechanic," said Catherine, sweet as vinegar. "Let the empire be entertained." Mara moved as if to stand beside Elias, but a guard blocked her with an easy cruelty. "I can endure it," said Naira, almost to herself. Elias looked at her and saw the angle of 1,000 rooms where she had been smaller than the expectation inside them. He put his hand on the engine casing. "Then so will I," said Elias. The stress armature engaged with a howl. The resonance engine bucked. The lattice shivered. The hall's ceiling wires flickered with the strain, throwing nets of white light over faces that wanted blood. Catherine smiled, and in that smile was the smallness of men who need the world to fail where they cannot succeed. Elias kept his palm against the casing. The temperature climbed. His skin picked up a quick burn, then a deep one. He tasted copper. Naira stood with her eyes closed, humming a sound so soft it might have been the idea of sound. The engine fought the armature like a heart fights a spasm. Elias's mind went to the barley fields, to the way wind never argued with the grain, only taught it to bow and then rise. He spoke to the engine the way he had spoken to himself after his wife had left in the old years when loneliness was a room that had learned his name. "You do not have to break to teach them," said Elias, not loudly, but with a weight of voice that machines like. Naira's hum bent half a note and slid into a chord. Her fingers flexed once in the air as if tugging a string nobody else could see. The engine steadied. The stress armature climbed its chart into red. Catherine frowned. He hit a control. The armature screamed and increased load. The engine rocked once. The lattice threatened to slip. The core flared with a gasping surge. "It needs a second voice," said Naira, eyes still closed. "I have only one song," said Elias. "Everyone has two," said Naira. Elias did not know what that meant until he remembered the tune his father had used when coaxing a broken winch. A counter-melody that never tried to lead, only to stand beside. He whistled badly. Naira smiled with her mouth closed. The harmonic dampeners drank the chaos and sent it back transformed, like grief made into a story told around a fire. The engine's light settled into a slow, deep pulse. Catherine lowered his hand from the control. His face had collapsed into calculation, a man running numbers too quickly to notice he'd left out mercy. The retinue's laughter had died into that thin brand of silence which precedes a person's next choice. Two Imperial drones, silent as guilt, drifted nearer to record the lattice angles. Elias realized with a flicker of pride he could not afford that Naira had brought them here into something like beauty and the machines had recognized her first. He looked at Naira. She opened her eyes for a moment. He thought he saw a different room reflected in them, a chamber of black mirrors, girls practicing steps they would never dance in public, a father who measured daughters with a ruler meant for monuments. "Enough," said Mara, voice shaking. "She did it. We all saw." Catherine's mouth twisted. He reached for the emergency kill to rip the armature off the engine like a limb, to create a failure that could be blamed. His finger hesitated. "Touch that switch and I weld your hand to it," said Elias. Catherine blinked. He looked from Elias to Naira to the engine that refused to die as asked. The hall breathed again, a long communal exhale. It wasn't just knowledge. It was legacy. And suddenly, silence fell across the crowd. The Empire loved a secret even more than it loved a show. When rumors reached the orbital court that the discarded daughter had sung a machine through cruelty, High Counselor Varen, Catherine's patron, descended to Aura to convert wonder to law. Varen was tall in the imperial way that made doors feel shorter in. His presence. His robe was a book of gold letters written in a language only the ambitious pretended to read. He arrived without trumpets, which was its own kind of trumpet. "Resonance engine survives armature stress under irregular lattice," said Varen after the demonstration replayed, drones humming around him like obedient flies. "Explain." "She listened," said Elias. "To what?" said Varen. "To the heart inside," said Elias. Varen's eyes registered amusement like a coin dropped into a well. "Poet mechanic, the Empire has catalogs for hearts. None are stored in engines." Naira stood to the side, the shape of refusal drawn small between her shoulders. "He is correct," said Naira softly. "But he is also correct. I listened to the heart mapped by the lattice. Every engine has a ghost geometry, the pattern it would choose if freed from the laziness of manuals." Varen turned his attention to her fully, and the hall felt smaller. "You speak as if the machines were kin," said Varen. "They are obedient only to those who treat them as more than obedience," said Naira. Catherine hovered behind Varen like a stain. "You will come to court," said Varen. "The Emperor's act of generosity must not lead to provincial superstition. We will test you where the instruments cannot lie." "She will not go alone," said Elias. "You are a mechanic of a field," said Varen. The court requires specialists in awe. I'll tune your engines until they confess all their sins, said Elias. But not without her. Varen's mouth curved. How quaint. Bring your quaintness then. It is good for the court to remember that planets exist below us. They traveled in one of the slimmer Imperial shuttles, the kind built for speed and message. Aura shrank beneath them, a coin sinking into wheat. Naira pressed her forehead to the cold of the viewport. Elias watched stars tilt into the window like stones rising from a riverbed. Why did he give you away? Said Elias. Because questions must be asked before they grow into walls. Naira did not answer for a time long enough to make it nearly honest. Because I am not as tall as his expectations, said Naira. And because he watches the council watch him, and a ruler becomes what the room requires. Some rooms require cruelty to feel safe. Does he love you? Said Elias. He loves the story where he is never smaller than anything, said Naira. I do not fit that story. So he edited me out. Elias touched the armrest until his bones remembered being held. Then let's write a new story where engines sing back. When the shuttle docked at Nexus Aurelian, the Imperial capital, the first air that touched Elias tasted of lightning and metal fruit. Towers stabbed the sky, plated in gold that drank the sun until the city shone like a wound. Bridges veined the air between towers, carrying the important toward one another in a hurry that made meaning seem like a luxury. The hall of radiant proof smelled of polished stone and fear. There, scientists and interpretive engineers waited to convert anything odd into a rule. Varen stood at the center, hands folded as if in prayer to his own cleverness. The Emperor was absent. The absence thundered. Begin, said Varen. They handed Naira a singularity spindle, the kind of delicate device that nudged time around itself like a shawl. The test was clear. Align its axes while a randomized field interfered, then stabilize without reducing power. You are trying to force a small body through a huge frame, said Naira, hooking the spindle to a harness without looking at the instruction feed. It resists because you have written its future too tightly. The future prefers schedules, said Varen. Only for those afraid to look it in the eyes, said Naira. She began to work. The spindle bucked and whined. Data sprayed around the chamber like furious confetti. Elias listened for the low tone that meant fear and the higher whisper that meant possibility. Naira found the chord between them. The spindle eased. Time in the room seemed to sigh and sit down. Several engineers took involuntary steps forward like people watching a wave become a wall become a wave again. Varen's composure was a coin wearing thin. You've been trained, said Varen. Somewhere secret. Naira's mouth opened, then closed. The room leaned into the silence. She is the last apprentice of the quiet line, said Elias before he knew he would speak. Heads turned. The name hung like incense. The quiet line was rumor wrapped in ritual. A closed chapter of imperial science that treated machines like co-authors, supposedly ended, supposedly forbidden. Varen's eyes sharpened until a person could cut themselves. That lineage is erased, said Varen. Erased on paper, said Naira. Not in blood. And whose blood exactly? Said Varen. Naira swallowed. Elias saw the choice form and harden. Truth as rebellion or silence as survival. But the final blow came not from words. It came from a name the galaxy had long forgotten. From the high doors, a shadow fell and Emperor Vir entered the hall. Silence is different when a sovereign makes it. Words fall out of people's mouths and have nowhere to land. Vir walked until he stood within the circle of instruments. He looked at Naira as if he had not expected to find her at the absolute center of a room. He looked at Elias as if humans had learned to grow spines while he wasn't watching. The court speaks of an old line, said Vir. A disobedient science. It speaks of your daughter, said Varen, each syllable kneeling and rising in calculation. Veer regarded Naira. For a beat, the weight of his gaze bent the air. The day I was crowned, I stood on a pedestal that made me taller than my father, said Veer. I mistook the stone for my bones. Perhaps I have made that mistake again. Naira's hands trembled. Father, said Naira, the word shaped like a long walk home and finding the door locked. Did you build this spindle song? Said Veer. I listened to it, said Naira. And did you inherit a forbidden name? Said Veer. You gave it to me the day you thought you discarded me, said Naira. You stripped me of title and gave me work. The quiet line is not a rebellion. It is a way of listening that refuses to make others smaller to feel tall. Varen shifted, sensing power tilt. Catherine, summoned for congratulations, hugged the edge of the room like mold hugging a damp wall. Veer removed a gauntlet. His blue skin beneath was scarred in the way only long rule scars a person, notches where decisions had cut too close. He placed his bare hand on the spindle. The device thrummed. Naira's eyes shone. Elias stood still, heart doing a slow, surprised thing. Teach me the note, said Veer. It is not one note, said Naira. It's a conversation. They stood like that. Emperor, mechanic, daughter, machine. An old geometry discovering a mindful version of itself. Engineers watched with the religious fear of people who suspect their life's altar is off by a degree. The court will not easily love what humbles it, said Varen soft. Dangerous. Veer did not turn. The court will adapt, said Veer. It always has after it snarled and counted. And Catherine, said Mara, who had slipped into the hall like Conscience finding an unlocked window. He tried to force failure to keep his job intact. Catherine puffed his cheeks. I followed procedure, said Catherine. Your procedure was cruelty wearing a badge, said Elias. Veer's gaze flicked to Catherine. The overseer withered visibly the way an opinion withers when required to stand alone. Leave your insignia, said Veer. Find employment where your breath cannot bruise others. Catherine's hands shook as he unpinned his badge. It hit the floor with the sound of a small door closing. Veer looked again at Naira. The corners of his mouth did a thing like breaking and like being rebuilt. I thought height would save us. Perhaps listening will, said Veer. Naira's chin lifted. I will return to Aura, said Naira, with Elias. We have engines to teach and fields to hear. And if I forbid it, said Veer, a father testing his last least useful weapon. Then you will have chosen your pedestal again, said Naira. Veer's hand fell. For a heartbeat, pride fought with love, the old imperial duel. Then he nodded. Go and make a sound the Empire cannot pretend not to hear, said Veer. They turned to leave. But as they crossed the threshold of the Hall of Radiant Proof, alarms opened like red flowers. The singularity spindle's output spiked. Varen's hand hovered near a hidden control. His mouth was calm. The room's time stuttered, then licked forward like a flame, warping the bridge outside into a bow. And as they walked away, the floor beneath them began to ripple. The ripple became a fracture. The fracture became possibility sharpened into danger. Varen had punched a number sequence that told the spindle to throw a time sleeve across the hall. Enough to embarrass, perhaps to wound, certainly to reassert the mathematics of power. He had written the Empire a story where accidents rescued pride. But stories answer to singers. Naira spun, hands out. Elias grabbed the spindle's tether and planted his boots. The sleeve rolled toward them like glass becoming water. Veer stepped forward, armor shedding plates so his limbs could move cleanly. The counter note, said Naira. Do I remember it? Said Elias. You remember grief? Said Naira. Bend it. He whistled badly, tenderly. Veer's chest yielded a low tone that might once have called soldiers to formation, now a father to belonging. Naira's voice braided between them, finding the gap Varen's numbers had insisted did not exist. The sleeve shivered like arrogance reconsidering. Instruments spat data that refused to sit. Varen lunged to reinforce the sequence, but Mara slammed her palm on the auxiliary board, introducing a noise neither calculus nor cruelty had accounted for. The clatter of community when it closes ranks. The time sleeve thinned. Naira touched the spindle and whispered, "Not to the machine alone. You are not their trick. Choose." It chose. The sleeve dissolved into a rain of bright, harmless seconds that soaked into skin like a promise kept. The hall exhaled a single breath that tasted of relief and of something new. Reverence not for height, but for harmony. Varen stood with his hand frozen half-reaching. He had bet on failure and lost to a song. "Arrest him," said Veer quietly. Guards who had learned obedience by rote found themselves obeying something more human. Varen's robes rustled like a book slamming shut. Catherine, small without his badge, slipped away, learning at last the mercy of anonymity. After, there were hours that felt like the long evening after rain, busy, gentle, important without shouting about it. Veer convened an emergency council and drafted a decree re-legalizing responsive mechanics, the old discipline his predecessors had framed as heresy to prevent their monuments from listening too closely. He named Naira First Listener. He named Elias Master of Field Harmonies, an absurd title that made them both laugh in private, then cry in a way that embarrassed neither. They returned to Aura with tools and a door opened in law. The barley bowed for them. Mara brought bread hot from a field oven. Children came curious and left embarrassed for the rhymes they had learned. Drones watched and learned new algorithms for wonder. Naira moved through the workshop with ease that looked like music. Elias learned how to let his old habits loosen the way bolts do in rain. He built benches for students who found their way from far settlements. He told them the first law: listen until the machine begins to speak, then listen harder. They tuned pump hearts to drink less power. They taught sides to bite kinder. They rewrote the etiquette between hand and hinge, empire and engine. The work spread faster than the empire could own it. Fields from Ariani to Solace Rim wrote letters. Real paper letters that smelled of dust and hope, asking for copies of the lattice angles and of the three-voice chord that had calmed a time sleeve. Sometimes Veer visited without ceremony. He stood with his hands folded behind him and watched schoolchildren lay their palms to casings and laugh when resonance tickled their bones. He and Naira spoke in quiet corners, learning how to be father and daughter without the lie of pedestals. Sometimes they argued. The arguments were better songs than silence had been. "Did I ruin years by measuring you against sky instead of soil?" said Veer once. "You gave me a field," said Naira. "I planted myself. You're invited to harvest." Elias kept working. He had loved a woman once long ago. He loved the plains too. Now he loved this improbable family the way a man loves a thing he never learned to ask for because he did not know it existed. He did not put names to the love because some loves grow better without being forced into topiary. He made breakfast, fixed engines, hummed in the wrong key, and it was often enough. On a night when the heat went soft and the barley shot silver under the moons, Naira and Elias stood by the fence where the fields begin to behave like sea. The machines in the shop hummed to themselves, settling into their dreams. "When you came, I thought you were a problem invited to dine," said Elias. "When I came, I thought I was the joke told by a very large room," said Naira. "We were both wrong," said Elias. She nodded. "Father sent a message. The council wants to codify the chords. They will try to flatten them into schedules." "They always will," said Elias. "Our work will always be to keep the heart a little unruly." "Will you keep singing with me?" said Naira. badly and forever," said Elias. A wind moved through the barley in a long patient arc somewhere an irrigation lung exhaled. The stars hung like bright punctuation in a sentence the world had been writing for a long time and only now dared to read aloud. In the years that followed, Aura hosted the Concord of listening. Artisans came who had grown tired of yelling instructions at things that wanted dialogue. The empire bent, then bowed, then called it its idea. A small sin forgiven by the good it let through the gates. Veer aged into a man the world could exhale around. Naira grew, not in centimeters the court could tally, but in reach. The taller courtiers found their eyes traveling downward more often to consult the person whose height had once threatened them. Elias's hands stayed scarred. He kept his old wrench with the chipped tooth that fit a bolt nothing else did. He hung it by the door where burdens become tools. On certain nights, memories still reached out its hand, the bitter kind made of echo and hunger. He would pause then, set his palm to an engine casing and feel it answer back. Machines do not cure loneliness, but they keep it company. People do the rest. Years later, when a child asked how it all began, he did not say, "A great emperor chose us." He did not say, "A cruel man nearly undid us." He said, "A sky too big tried to convince a girl she was small." A mechanic was quiet enough to hear the lie closing in. We learned a chord and played it until the room found a better story of itself. The planes, 100 machines picked up his voice and made a low, contented sound. The barley kept breathing its ancient breath. The empire remained ridiculous in armor, but more reasonable in law. And on a workbench, the first resonance engine Naira ever tuned in public still wore its lattice with pride, irregular, precise, forgiving. In a universe built on arrogance, sometimes a single act of dignity is enough to shift the stars themselves. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear them moving.